Thank you, everyone, once again for joining me week after week for these live internet studies. We missed last week due to some unforeseen circumstances that were out of my control, but I'm glad to be back in the driver's seat again. Let's jump right into our study. We are in the Matthew 9:14 through 17, Judaism v. Christianity. It's kind of the short running title for this particular study. And it's a fairly new study. We're only in about, say, part 15 or episode 15 or however you want to describe it. So we should be starting, I think, number 16 tonight. This is number 16. Let's jump in. Let me read the verse real quick for you. You can see it on my screen. I'll read that first so that you can understand what verse I'm working from, and then I'll just jump right into my own commentary, which is available on my website. So on the page right now, you can see I say, here's one version of Yeshua's parable as rendered from the Matthew 9:14 through 17 reading. So let me read it for you. Starting in verse 14, these are Yeshua's words. He says, Matthew writing, "Then the disciples of John came to Yeshua, asking him, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?' Verse 15, "And Jesus said to them, 'The attendants of the bridegroom cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they?' Continuing, 'But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast.' Verse 16, "But no one puts a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment, and a worse tear results." Continuing, verse 17, "Nor do people put new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the wineskins burst, and the wine pours out, and the wineskins are ruined. But Jesus says, they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved." And that rendering of the Matthew passage that we just read is from the New American Standard Bible. Okay, so this passage is a parable, but it's a kind of a working anecdote, where Yeshua's drawing some common sense teaching from everyday examples that people of that day would have been familiar with. The whole idea about putting wine into wineskins and patches of cloth onto garments and things like that, as well as the opening words about mourning and fasting with the bride and the bridegroom, the marriage theme there. This is going to be more relevant for the people of that day and that time. Maybe these days we're not understood. We don't. If you talk about weddings and marriages, people aren't talking about mourning and fasting, and we certainly don't talk a lot about putting patches of. We don't talk about shrinking clothing before we sew patches onto them, things like that. Most people don't. If some article of clothing's worn out, you just go to the store and buy a new one. Or you hand it down to your younger brother, right? He gets all the hand-me-downs, and you get all the brand new clothes. At least that's how it was in my family, right? And then he's got this statement about new wine, old wine, and things like that. I'm not even a wine drinker to begin with, and even if I were, I'm not making my wine. I'm not concerned about putting old wine and new wine into old skins and new skins and all that stuff. I mean, what's all that about? Even people who are wine drinkers that I know don't have a clue what it means to you. Do we even use wine skins? Come on. So all of this has to make sense to his original readers first in order for them to even infer the lesson or the principle of what he's trying to talk about. So let's skip past a paragraph in my commentary that we already looked at and just jump down into this one. And then we're going to be ready tonight to start looking at some examples of explanation from Pastor John Piper. We'll break into that tonight. But let's continue or conclude with this introduction portion of my study. So here's how my commentary reads. I have to say, the primary passage in question will be Matthew 9:14 through 17, even though I say a parallel of this passage does exist in Mark 2:18 through 22, as well as Luke 5:33 through 39. You're always encouraged when you're reading through your Bible to be aware of the fact that, especially if you're reading through the synoptics or the Gospels, that one version of the story may show up in another one of the gospel writers. And it's helpful if you're doing a meaningful Bible study to be aware of those other readings, so you can be aware that there sometimes are details that were either left out in the version that you're reading, or he spins it a little differently, because each writer sometimes tells the story slightly differently. And so that's always helpful. We're not going to do that tonight. in this particular study. Just I want you to be aware of the fact sometimes you only find a story that shows up once, but in this case, it does show up in the two other gospel writers. I continue. I want to answer my own question right up front, and the questions are have to do with. If you're not following the series, if you haven't binged watched it and you're unaware if it's your first time, this is the first video you're watching. Part of the questions that I'm proposing in this particular study is, when we read this passage about unshrunk cloth and old wine and new wine and things like that, if you're aware of the average Christian commentary or sermon on this parable or story of Yeshua's, you're aware that many Christian pastors spin this topic to have Yeshua's talking about Christianity is really incompatible with Judaism. The old wineskin is Judaism, the new wineskin is Christianity, the old wine is Judaism, the new wine is Christianity, things like that. And Yeshua is clearly working from this anecdotal principle that there's going to be some conflict if you mix the old and the new together, right? He's talking about the wineskins bursting if you put old wine into new wineskins and things like that.